Welcome to the first conversation of Riga Security Forum 2024. It's already the sixth year when we offer in the period of October to December various conversations about topical security issues in both the immediate and outermost regions. And this time we're going to talk about the United Nations. Next year we will celebrate 80th anniversary since founding of the United Nations. And as we all know, the United Nations was founded with the objective to ensure security and peace in the world and to provide assistance. But actually, in this century, we are living for 25 years already, and the situation around the world has become, well, let's say, full of challenges maybe, or anxious would be the correct word to say, because very close to us, conflict, war in Ukraine. Already 3 years, the situation in the Middle East has escalated. Also, various activities are taking place in the Asia region, which causes such stress throughout the world. And so, the questions occur: how operationally successful, how topical is the United Nations at the moment and the Security Council of the United Nations, and whether certain reforms are necessary. And let us continue about these very topics and let us discuss them with our guests. And this is head of Chancery of the President of the Republic of Latvia, Gunda, Reire, and this very long and complex title. And this is the Ambassador of Special Tasks of the Secretariat of the Candidate of Latvia to the UN Security Council, Andrejs Pildegovičs. And I will start with some cannons, with big shots. Many of us have this on our tongue, the question whether the United Nations organization and its created global political system model, is it nowadays relevant and the most appropriate? Because you've both been involved very closely and you have something to say. So, Madame Wanda. Yes, thank you. And what comes to my mind is what Churchill said about democracy. Nothing better has been invented. And I think that it also applies to the United Nations organization. And I think that the trap which we most often fall into is like two ditches, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. One ditch is to try to idealize it, to imagine what other international organization could be better than the countries that shape, but it's impossible. But on the other hand, we should not demonize the organization too. The world has not become much more complicated or violent than it's been in the 50s, in the 70s, or in the 90s. That's first of all. Conflicts are present. That is, so to speak, in the international politics, conflict is present and present always. And secondly, of course, nothing is ideal, but it is also not invalid under any circumstances. UN is not just about and not only Security Council, although, of course, the Security Council is very important and influential, and in the UN Charter it is responsible for its main functions, that is, maintenance of international peace and security. But if we look in the history, or if we look nowadays, the Security Council is not completely frozen. Of course, it can't make any decisions regarding Russia's aggression against Ukraine, but it makes other decisions. It is the place where issues of international peace and security are decided, and in many cases they really have been decided. And there are many examples when the Security Council has established peace operations that have been very successful. So the conclusions are very diverse, and it would be best to be looking at it, so to speak, by weighing both sides, both ditches, both extremes from the UN perspective, but on the other hand, just it has a huge function. The UN itself is a multifunctional organization engaged in very, very many different things, and it is also successful in many of them. By the way, Latvia has been present and still is. I'll probably add, or maybe highlight some of the points. If we look historically, then from those 80 years, for more than 40 years, Latvia has been denied the opportunity to participate in the United Nations. And in fact, Baltic states, former People's Union, were forcibly isolated from the UN formation process. And of course, it is our historical trauma. And I think that it is also an additional encouragement to be particularly active, especially loud. And secondly, of course, membership in the UN, it is essential. And let's say it's like a country's international recognition, or the most striking proof thereof. Until you are the member of the UN, you have severely limited opportunities to participate in UN processes. Maybe you can participate in the Olympics, but some more serious organizations, you can't even dream about being a member. So first step in membership in the European Union, membership in NATO, and so on, it's been for us. And thirdly, perhaps I would like to emphasize that maybe some 30 years ago, and when the world was different, we could think that the United States would solve everything for us, or maybe the European Union is such a global strength and center, and we might think that superpowers will somehow cope with the management of the world or arrangement of the world processes. Let's not be naive. The world develops, and not always in favorable directions. And that is where every voice and every member country matters. And the General Assembly of the UN is often compared to the world's parliament. We know a lot about the European Parliament. We know that it might not be as effective or maybe as capable, but the UN General Assembly is something similar, but on a global scale. And it really doesn't matter if the country has 10,000 inhabitants or 1 billion. Each of us has our own rights, our own voice. And I think that the Baltic states, and this is what we've proven and shown, that we use every opportunity to speak at this great microphone, and we initiate things and we defend what is important to us. We want the world, we see the world, and our allies, and as for example our allies is Ukraine, and we want to take care of our own interests. So maybe one thing, you have already mentioned Ukraine. Ukraine is for almost 3 years now in the center, in the focus, and it's been a little bit like the focus has moved away lately, but how much this issue is even raised at the UN level? Because I have the feeling that we really see what American political leaders do, European leaders do, United Nations level. It's such a feeling that either we don't hear enough about it, or maybe we're just not listening. Because the UN General Assembly High-Level Week, just September, I think that there were 3 topics that were everywhere: Ukraine, Middle East, and the UN Security Council. But of course, the second thing is the General Assembly, which I just mentioned. In the Security Council, we see that from the side of Russia, any attempts with Russia, they are blocking any substantive questions about Russia, but that doesn't mean that Security Council wasn't talking about it, that the Security Council's agenda is not limited to only such meetings, such sittings, but there are various forums, formal and informal, where this happens, and allies and like-minded partners are working not to lose this topic from the agenda. It is very important. And then also remembering that UN is not just the Security Council or this high-level week. but Ukraine topic, and there are involved many various UN agencies. Let us remember once again that UN is huge. Okay, well, let's say some believe it to be more too bureaucratically bloated, but let us remember that the functionality is maximum. It deals with international peace and security, but it also deals with education, culture, refugee issues, and it works with the provision of assistance to the humanitarian aid, and it's an international community that deals with it. So Ukraine is a topic, and only we can regret externally that Security Council cannot make any decisions, but it is very sad and tragic, but there are objective reasons this time. I agree that, of course, it's been a long time since the shock from the Russia invasion, and it's a member state brutally invaded a neighboring country in violation of the UN Charter and basically declaring openly that it basically wants to split another UN member state and wants to make it like some kind of formation with limited sovereignty. But of course, the Russian aggression has many dimensions. We are talking about humanitarian considerations, we're talking about sexual violence in conflicts, we're talking about nuclear safety, we are talking about the need to create a special tribunal. We're talking about demining and how to help Ukraine to survive already the third winter. Many aspects, and I can attest from my own experience that every agency has like champions, like leaders of certain topics and questions for them to persistently push these topics on the agenda. I don't want to single out Latvians, but at the very beginning of the war, personally, I took 13 ambassadors of the European Union to the Secretary General and urged that in all UN documents they would use the precise, exact formulations in relation to this aggression, that it is war, invasion and aggression and nothing less. Let us just remember that at the beginning many tried to use all sorts of euphemisms, politically correct expressions that there is a conflict or a Ukrainian situation and so on. But you're right. There's many shocks, Sudan, Iran, Myanmar. But those issues that are important to us, we need them on the agenda, and thus presence of the Baltic states in the UN Security Council is also as a guarantee that the subject will not disappear. Lithuania, in 2014, when there was annexation of Crimea, they beat their fist on the table and urged to use the correct language, pointing out that it is aggression, that otherwise it's like a slide which would lead to much greater tragedies. And then Lithuanians were not listened to, but it was important. We need the Baltic states to be capable, democratic states with the rule of law at this table, because we don't want to repeat the 30s of the last century when our leaders thought, let us be better quiet, invisible, not joining regionally, let's not cooperate. Maybe that is how we'll be able to survive the winter, so to speak, but we all remember how it all went. So we should learn from this history and strive to be in guard of the interests of our region in this very complex ecosystem, in a very complex network, but with a clear awareness and clear priorities. We'll come back to the Security Council. You have already mentioned the UN Secretary General, and what I noticed lately is that Mr. Guterres is quite harshly criticized for how he communicates about various conflicts and different situations, and the latter was the situation in the Middle East, he was also urged to think about the matter of the civilians not being killed and to express his opinion, and somehow he was also called a sympathizer to the opponents of Israel. But what do you think? What about these expressions and trends thereof of thinking? How much does that influence such structures as the United Nations and their political agenda, behavior and decisions? You mean the activities of the Secretary General? Well, let's say, for example, in the world, or let's say in Europe, ever more popular become conservative ideas, national ideas. On the contrary, there are liberal ideas, and then some conflicts arise. And as we know, there's also these things are cyclical. But does that influence the work of organization? So I think that there are two parts of that question. There is subjective and human factor. We can't escape that. Maybe somebody thinks that it's not a good thing, however, it's not some kind of automatic and robotic organization. But if we talk about the Secretary General, I have to say that if we read the statutes and what is the role that is intended for the Secretary General, or if we look at it historically, what the Secretary Generals have done or have not done, then this is an interesting question, where the UN Charter is actually very, well, in their language, very limited. It's not much more than the chief administrative manager, but secondly, there is some kind of legislative function also present, and the history shows that the UN Secretary General, their first task, and what is the states also expect, is for them to be neutral. It's like the speaker in the parliament, already was compared. So representing all 193. That's first. But secondly, this role also combines a lot of different aspects. That is not just an administrative manager. This role is enormous because the Secretary General also runs the Secretariat, which is a giant organization, very multinational. There's also a political role and the role of diplomatic balancer. And this is what they expect, the member states expect. But everyone can fill this role in very different ways. And we have seen administrative, well, like Secretaries General who put more emphasis on administrative work. But then there are like Dag Hammarskjöld, which is, in my personal opinion, has been perhaps the most spectacular and expressive. We had Kofi Annan, our former president Vairvīti Freiberg was his special envoy, and we come back to these UN reform issues again, and there are different experiences. So each Secretary General can fulfill their position differently, and we have a diverse spectrum historically. I'll comment a bit from a different perspective. One thing I have noticed while working at the UN is now basically before the beginning of the Russian aggression, I concluded that the expertise of the UN Secretariat, the expertise on Russia was very weak. During Cold War, the study of the Soviet Union, analysis of the Soviet Union. Also, in UN, there was much attention drawn to this. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, everything that is related to Russia, and also to a large extent these CIS, well, in essence, it was largely delegated to the UN, so OSCE in Vienna. And for 3 decades in New York, there was very little expertise on Russia. And I think that also to the Secretary General himself, the Russian war was a big shock. We tried to warn him. I mentioned in one conversations with him, he did not believe that this was going to happen. It seemed that he lived in some other reality, and with much difficulty did he accept the reality. And it is another encouragement why we, the Baltic states, Poland, the Czech Republic and Scandinavian countries, we need to be particularly loud, because also the South countries and more distant countries are listening to that. They don't like what Brussels says, but they believe more what the neighboring countries of Russia say, and that is what I think and where we can get more involved. Maybe in such lesser known area, that is how we perform, and we are trying to reach the understanding of also more remote regions. And thirdly, speaking specifically about the Secretary General, about the current Secretary General, we are all human beings with our own past and identity. Mr. Gutierrez comes from, by his political conviction, he's a socialist, and he represents the generation of Portuguese politicians who were fighting for decolonization of Africa. He has his own understanding of how the world has evolved, and maybe psychologically closer to him are the problems of South America and Africa, and that is why, to some extent, we need to help to educate him and convince him that Russia, what it is, in fact, is different from how it was described in the history books. And something else to what Andrejs mentioned is that this topic, I think, is present somewhere. Constantly there are conflicts around the world. Approximately 30 conflicts have always been existing in the world at any point, and this level of violence, of course, is diverse. And this is another task. Then we must be able to tell our expertise about Russia. We are listened to more seriously. You also mentioned the neighbors closer and farther, but also we shouldn't be like just phobia-obsessed Baltic colleagues. On the other hand, we need to be empathetic enough to realize that in other parts of the world they have their own problems. And believe me, in Africa and Latin America, it is also difficult. It's also hard for them. So that is one more thing, that if we are only now globalizing our foreign policy, because previously we've been more concentrated on the regional politics, this is something that we need to keep in mind. One thing is to defend our own interests, and in this case, the war in Ukraine stands out beyond others because this aggression is the big five member state with veto powers and nuclear powers. And by the way, we have already experienced the blackmail with nuclear weapons, but we need to also be able to listen to the problems of the other parts of the world, and that is why it is sometimes also crucial. Several times we have mentioned the reform of the Security Council. At the beginning of this year, if I'm not mistaken, there was a proposal of the reforms of G4 countries. And these were the 5 major reforms to increase the Security Council's permanent member number, the regional distribution, which much larger, where the regions would be represented, which currently are not, maybe complete abolition of the veto rights and changes in the system, and also in the UN General Assembly. So there have always been discussions whether and what is even necessary, and even if it's possible, because for some it is warm and comfortable, but somebody needs more or wants more. Do you see that any of those questions, maybe theories, are even possible in the near future? Because given that in separate issues we are stuck, and are we expecting any changes? I think that there's probably no reason to hope on some sort of very radical decisions. But I'd say that its reform is like creeping, and it's characteristic to large organizations. It's actually a continuous process. And I think above all, I mean constructively motivated reformist governments, to which I also include Latvia in this group, we have been able to manage, for example, this veto initiative a couple of years ago. We have achieved that now the big five who have the right of veto, no longer can they actually sweep under the carpet any issue. They can't just put an end to, and to put blindly, they cannot shut mouths of everyone. Now, there's a new procedure adopted that within 10 days of any issue where the veto automatically, where there's the use of veto, automatically it goes to the General Assembly, and there's a possibility of full debate, asking questions, and confrontation. Well, maybe this does not have any binding decisions. However, the big five can no longer stop the discussion. That is one example. The second example is, I think, we shouldn't belittle it, is that the elected states too have ensured that increasingly the UN Security Council is looking at a wider range of thematic issues. If in the past, for example, there were only classic conflicts and wars, now we are actually debating cybersecurity, artificial intelligence. Southern countries very much want to talk about the impact of climate on security. This is always an issue. Subject to regular debate, we're talking about humanitarian protection for women and children, disinformation, among others. And these issues of concern to small countries, endangered countries, in one or another way, they actually are on the agenda. And some might say that this is something very minor, insignificant, but we are making the procedures understandable, simpler, and more transparent. Well, in the past, for example, the Secretary General candidates were somehow pulled out of the bag, and the countries were, it just was put on the table, and that's it, first in the Security Council and then in the General Assembly. But now we have achieved a more transparent procedures for candidates to come to the audition. They need to offer their program very early, and we know much more about this candidate and their career and financial situation and so on. Either way, we are trying to make both the UN and UN Security Council a lot much more open, so that there is no such idea present that somewhere in the dark there is the room of five, of the big five who reign the world, and the others, 193 countries, simply salute and in essence can't affect anything. So in these directions we are trying to work. Of course, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned, we believe that it is very important to create the special tribunal for the crimes of aggression. Because if there is a tribunal, if there is going to be a conviction for Russia for causing this terrible war, it will not only be a significant political decision of the General Assembly, which has already been formulated in 7 resolutions of the General Assembly, but it will also be a legal judgment of the International Tribunal that will say that Russia is an aggressor state, and it will serve as the legal basis that certainly clearly says that to all the skeptics that Russia, as a permanent state, is violating the UN Charter, and we then begin the discussion whether their voting rights are being frozen or suspended. It will depend on how the discussion will develop in the General Assembly and what decisions will be made in the tribunal. Well, theoretically, we can suspend their rights. There is a certain legal mechanism Because about the exclusions, the statutes regulate the procedure by how we can accept, but they're not talking about exclusion. Suspension of the right of vote is actually provided for, and it is possible in such cases with a huge majority, of course, and if it is possible if the state systematically violates some guiding principles of the statutes. But considering that, in this situation even, Russia is not recognized as an aggressor in such, because they wouldn't be allowed to participate in voting. I think this idea is theoretical. And also about the reform on the Security Council, what Andrei mentioned is that those are small steps, but very important steps. And as I said at the beginning, is this whether or, like, idealized or demonized approach. It does not help. We need to do what we can. And from the point of view of the main problem is unrepresentative, so lack of representation. We may for a long time say or whine how bad it is or moan, but it's nothing. In order to change it, we need the vote of General Assembly before there's a vote of Security Council, and we need agreement in the Big Five. But if we talked about Big Five and veto, it's not fair to be talking about the five, because the Great Britain and France are not exercising this right, they're not using the veto right. We're talking about actually three veto options, which is, by the way, a result of lengthy discussions. And now we have these two European states that have waived to exercise these rights. And so I think that the real problem then is somewhere else, but this is what we have, and we need to play with the cards we are dealt. We have come to the question that is probably the most interesting to Latvia, that is candidacy for the UN Security Council's non-permanent state status. And the big fight will probably be next year, but possible participation in the Security Council 26-27, maybe we may remind what are the main questions. Why do we want to be there? Why it is important to us? And what will be our top priority that we will make as our main motto of our activities? It's like Andrejs' time to shine. Yes, in 2011 we have already announced our candidacy, and from the Baltic states we are the last to be candidates for this post, but elections will be held in 2025. It's not guaranteed. We have competition with Montenegro, another diplomatic ally of NATO, and so from the group of Eastern European countries in which we are, I'd say that these the special meaning of this nomination is in foreign service. It's become clear to us, as I mentioned already, at the time of the occupation of Crimea, because then we felt and we saw that Russia is changing in a completely destructive direction. And then we saw that even some of our allies do not fully understand those risks, those threats that we see from the East. And even then, France, for example, had doubts whether it is really an aggression. Does annexation really mean that Russia has some other goals too? But over the course of this time and during the last 3 years, this candidacy has become ever more relevant. And of course, comprehensive support and all the support to Ukraine is the real goal, why we believe we have to be there. And we need to take care for the attention to Ukraine would be duly paid. And of course, we are also we are guardians of the international law. I like Leinart Meri quote that in 30 years, international law is basically a nuclear weapon of smaller states. Well, this is a tool. These are the arguments that small countries can use to fight for their rights, appealing to international courts, justifying their reasoning, appealing to the international thought, and so on. And I also mentioned everything that is related to the eradication of impunity, be it sexual violence in armed conflicts and assistance to the victims of conflicts. Of course, the Baltic states have unique expertise when it comes to cybersecurity. Estonia was in fact the first country to bring this topic to the UN agenda. Back then, Russia and cyber attacks against Georgia were topical. Later, Albania from our group raised these issues in relation to attacks of Iran. And this year, Korean Republic also, they lit up to the Security Council the special field North Korea some ransomware. And I think that in this domain, in this field, there are many threats. Traditionally, we're talking about cybersecurity, information security, disinformation, maybe also in relation to the artificial intelligence, where the Great Britain were the first to initiate debate on the 23rd of July. So our range of interests is pretty clear, and I personally am very optimistic that we will be there. And I'd like to also mention that approximately 10 years ago, here in the Baltic states, and diplomats of the northern countries and ministers discussed that we need to ensure that in at least one northern state is always in the UN Security Council. We are in such a region. This year, Denmark was elected. We are hoping that it's going to be Latvia and then Finland. So we are going to represent ourselves, the Baltic states, and also northern countries. So membership for small countries in the UN Security Council. There is less hope for gaining more influence, but higher expectations on the increase in their international status. I actually wanted to say the same thing, yes. Indeed, I really wanted to add what Andrejs said in terms of international law, because we really have several plans and ideas we want to achieve in the Security Council, and I'm also participating in those optimistic expectations. But I think it is very important to remember that these are it's not just empty words. UN is the citadel of international justice and multilateralism, and there's a rule-based international order. And if it begins to crumble, then we, along with other small democratic states, come to pretty much existential situation. Because as long as the international rules and rights are universal, and this rule-based international order somehow holds together, for us this arrangement is a safe haven. It is an opportunity to participate in making the decisions on issues in the world, but if it begins to squint, then where does it lead? It leads to regionalization and fragmentation or marginalization of international law. It automatically leads to what Andrejs said about also with the Union of Nations. It leads to the power of politics, of superpowers, which is the least advantageous situation we can even imagine, which means that our role then is zero. It does not mean that we are going to achieve some kind of victory at the end of the 90s, for example, the moment of ideas, but the idea is when we are there, and this is very exhausting work, it is to hold and to have to preserve what we have. Another thought, in a good sense, I'd say that this membership and candidacy in the Security Council, it is also a contribution to the Latvian economy. And it is also a contribution in the marketing of the state of Latvia, because maybe some empirical examples, maybe subjective examples, but I am watching myself that over the past years, such maybe very remote countries are showing their desire to accredit its ambassadors in our country. Oman from Persian Gulf, or Belize from Central America. Well, I don't believe that is somehow simply abstract. Somebody just in the capital of Oman, they figured out where else should we accredit our ambassadors. Well, let's say Latvia. I think they are watching the countries that play an active role in international politics. And we saw recently the visit of Kagame, Rwanda president. And this is the first leader of African countries which is on a bilateral visit, if I understand correctly, yes. And of course there were also some... so visit was prepared for about 2 years. And a situation, very interesting synergy formed regarding the understanding and evaluation of history, well, genocide of Rwanda, genocide against the Baltic states and the Baltic people. So there was some kind of formation of mutual interests, but the Security Council, I believe, that is also one such magnet that stimulates interest in Latvia, that stimulates interest in economic conflicts, and of course our interest in cyberspace, digital issues also resonates with our export interests. I think this aspect should definitely be taken into consideration. And I now want to actually unleash maybe some diplomatic secret with how many national representatives we have talked about supporting our candidacy. I'd say we talked, well, it's easier to tell who we did not speak to. Of course, we did not speak to aggressor states, the Russian Federation, Belarus. We did not speak to North Country and Syrian Republic. Basically, those countries that have taken a criminal position. We did not talk to Taliban and also but these states which represent the previous democratic regime in New York and their diplomats, let's say important aspect is also that basically our representation in the UN is the last and the first line of defense. Even when there are military coups and other collisions and conflicts, the country is fighting for the right people to be in New York and present to represent the country, to be like the last bastion. Well, speaking about the occupation of Latvia as embassies back then in London and Washington. So these are the ones on votes of which we don't hope, but with the other countries we maintain diplomatic relations. We try to look for contacts, and with some of the countries we also conclude mutual support agreements. But in any way, we are listening to others also, and we are ready to tell about our interests for those who are willing to listen. Well, at this point, I will say thank you, Andrejs Pildegovičs and Gunda Reire, for this discussion here, and I will remind you that this has been Riga Security Forum Season 6, first conversation, which in the period of time since from October to December, you'll be able to listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and also search for it on the website of the Riga Security Forum. Thank you very much, and until next time.